So the plans for the Ukrainian counteroffensive have been leaked by Russia, sort of. I mean, Yevgeny Prigozhin laid out what he believes is in the works, so let's pick that apart and see how it stands up over the next few months. For a little context here, Yevgeny Prigozhin is the leader of the Russian Wagner Group. That's a private military company closely tied in with the Russian military. The group has been used by Russia as a way to kind of project power into conflict zones without technically putting Russian boots on the ground. Now, I think you could kind of hand wave that concept because Wagner is essentially operating as an arm of the Russian military today. I mean, it's sort of the same as calling this a special military operation instead of a war. However, the role of Wagner being outside the Russian Ministry of Defense does actually matter when digging into Prigozhin's prediction here. Over the last few months, if you've been keeping up with the progress in Ukraine, you'll have noticed that Wagner is getting much more attention than any other Russian units. At least that's the case in most Western media outlets outside of Russia. The reason for that attention is that the heaviest fighting for some time now has been in and around Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, and that fight is largely being carried out by Wagner forces. Pulling up a quick map here of the situation at Bakhmut, you'll hear folks from one side say that it shows a continued Russian advance, whereas the other view is that the big, impressive Russian military is now measuring success by tens of meters at a time in a town very few people even knew existed just 6 months ago. Either way, the progress of the Russian advance here has resulted in the largest change in territorial control over the last 5 months of the war. You have to go back to the Russian withdrawal from Kherson in November to see the last big shift in the front lines, but if you're looking at just Russian progress, you're going to have to go back even further to July when Severodonetsk and Lysychansk fell. So if we're talking about really any sort of Russian advance on the battlefield over the last 9 to 10 months, it's the Wagner Group. That's why they're getting the attention that they are. All of that attention has elevated Prigozhin quite a bit over the last year. Now, there are people who have dedicated their careers to understanding the inner workings of the Kremlin leadership, power struggles, and alliances. I'm not one of them, so I'll try to stay out of that water, but it's obvious that Prigozhin has taken on a level of influence throughout the war that he did not have previously. And he's used that influence to criticize some of the Russian formal military leadership. Just in the last few months, Prigozhin has spoken out about how ammunition is being withheld from his men, labeling Defense Minister Shoigu's action as, quote, high treason. He's also suggested publicly that Shoigu's 33-year-old son, after supposedly liking a handful of anti-war content on social media, should be sent to the front where Prigozhin would train him personally. I bring all this up to say that everything Prigozhin does is likely in his own self-interest, and that includes sharing his expectations for any sort of Ukrainian counteroffensive. The video I'm going to show here wasn't put together out of the goodness of his own heart, so we have to keep in the back of mind that we don't know for sure his goal in actually sharing this. We also have to consider that he might just be making all this up to essentially troll the Russian Ministry of Defense, sort of a way of showing that he knows better what is happening across the front than they do. So with that background and the qualifiers aside, let's take a look at Prigozhin's prediction. The video I'm going to show here was translated and shared by Dimitri, who runs War Translated on Twitter. He puts out a crazy amount of content that's really valuable for anyone interested in following this conflict. It's all free, but he does have a Patreon account if anyone is interested in supporting his work. I am a proud patron of his, so we could, be patrons together. The link to his Twitter and Patreon accounts are in the description below. Now, I'm going to read the translation as this video plays, and then I'll stop it throughout to add my own 2 cents. What is the enemy doing? Spring is coming. The ground is drying, the wind is blowing, and the temperature is 15 to 18 degrees. So everything is favorable to allow driving heavy vehicles on the fields. Ukrainians receive huge amounts of various NATO vehicles, armored vehicles, tanks, Leopards that everyone is discussing. They prepared reserves, we'll clarify later, of about 200,000 people. 200,000 of reserves, what the Ukrainians are going to do. Okay, so this video came out a little less than a week ago on or around March 23rd. So as to the weather, it does look like Ukraine is expecting rain from April 1st to April 7th. Temperatures look to be above freezing during that time, but if we're considering how much mud will impact the fight, probably safe to assume that any major armored maneuver will have to wait until at least the 10th or so, depending on how fast things can dry out. Prigozhin cites the Western weaponry that's made its way to Ukraine. This isn't anything new, and really since the offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv last fall, much of the talk has been that Ukraine needs to refit with this new equipment before they can make any sort of next push. There have been reports over the last few days that Western tanks are starting to arrive in Ukraine, which is a little bit earlier than most people expected. But this is one of those items where if we see pictures and videos publicly, that likely means that equipment has been there for a little while. That's been the pattern pretty much with any sort of anticipated new gear flowing into Ukraine. It's on the way sometime in the future, and then boom, it's being used. Prigozhin also talks about a Ukrainian force of 200,000 being prepared. This syncs with what most Western analysis over the last few months have been talking about, how Ukraine is using the winter months to essentially build up new combat brigades that can be used to spearhead some sort of offensive come spring. Now, in terms of the number, 200,000, I don't have any clarity on that. My gut says that's a big number to have held back from the front, but we're just going to have to wait and see. Ukrainians will concentrate them in various places, talking about the 200,000. They'll have several objectives they will be reaching. Going from north to south, the first strike they're likely to try to deal. They'll try to go to the territory of Belgorod for it to become a good exchange benefit, to put pressure on the Russian Federation. So the border between Belgorod and Kharkiv must be reinforced as much as possible. And it must be practically impregnable. I hope that's the case. Starting out with a bang here, huh? So any sort of Ukrainian action focused on Belgorod, which is internationally recognized as Russian territory, does seem to be pretty high risk. Prigozhin makes a valid argument that it could be used as a bargaining chip at the negotiating table, but this is one that I have a hard time believing. There's this conversation that an attack on Russian soil would prompt Russia to take further action in the war, but that kind of suggests that they've been holding back in some way, and I'm not really on board there. Now, a Ukrainian attack on Belgorod would make for a great recruiting campaign to build up the forces, and you could easily see Putin seizing on that. That's not an immediate item, though. It takes time to pull in, equip, and even modestly train forces before sending them out to the front. To me, the biggest risk for Ukraine here is that they may lose some of their leverage with their NATO partners. So lots of people are on board supporting the defensive war, but taking the fight to Russian territory might not have the same level of backing with an international community. Even if it was for a strategic purpose, my personal opinion here is that it would, at the very least, cause some hesitation in the continued support from some of Ukraine's allies. I'm not sure all of that support is worth a bargaining chip, at least not right now. Secondly, north to south, they'll definitely try to break the Savato-Crimea line to reach Veluki. My apologies on pronunciations. I know they're never good. Third, they'll concentrate on Bakhmut. More in detail on Bakhmut now. In order to strike the Russian formations, and in a certain way demoralize the forces and have a good advantage, and also not allow what's being strategically, absolutely correctly planned by the Ministry of Defense, which is after taking Bakhmut, open an operational space. If you look at the map, this is the contact line with a maximum concentration of hostilities being in Bakhmut. And this is deep operational space. Endless fields until the Dnieper. And actually until Europe. If you're a migrating bird, you can fly to Paris and poop on the Eiffel Tower. I feel like that's probably not the word he actually used. Dimitri keeping it PG in the translations. But as of today, the enemy concentrated a group of 80,000 plus. This group around Bakhmut is in Seversk, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhivka, Konstantivka, and Chasiv Yar. I'm glad the names are on the screen, so you don't have to go exclusively my pronunciation. This sort of ring is an element of the Donbass ring followed by constant fields. So the main objective of Ukrainians is to hold these lines. While holding these lines, they have pretty good maneuverability here. They can go further and try to cut PMC Wagner units, which I already spoke about a month ago. Wagner units envelop the AFU group in Bakhmut, putting pressure on it. While the task of AFU is to envelop Wagner. As soon as they cut out Wagner from this sort of piece, then they'll open a hole of about 30 to 40 kilometers where they can infiltrate, concentrate. Prigozhin talks here about operational space, which isn't really a term we use in the United States. What he's getting at is that the area behind the Donbass line is easier to traverse and less defended than what they're up against now. Lots of debate to be had there, though. We've heard time and again in this conflict that as soon as one area falls, that'll be it. Yet here we are more than a year into the full-scale invasion. Prigozhin is definitely playing the role of general here. I mean, what he's talking about is what we consider within an area of operations as the deep area, a place where effort is put into shaping the future fight. Think of targeting logistics hubs, rail lines, troop transports, etc. That's not usually something that falls to the ground force commander in a certain sector, but to an officer overseeing the fight at the operational level, at least a few tiers above Prigozhin. His 80,000 number for Ukrainian troops in this area, not crazy. Worth noting, he's not talking about a consolidated Ukrainian force of 80,000, but that they're dispersed across this roughly 400 square mile area. Given that's where most of the intense fighting has occurred over the last few months, sounds about right that Ukraine would at least focus some troops in that area. Moving on, he talks about how Ukraine's goal will be to remove the Wagner forces from the Bakhmut area, which will open up 30 to 40 kilometers of territory. My read there is that this area between Bakhmut and the M04 doesn't have substantial defensive positions, and that Wagner is focusing most of their energy right now at the point of attack. So looking at a map, you can sort of see this potential pocket. It sits behind Bakhmut with Hrivka to the south, Bryanka due east, and Popasna to the north. Zooming out a little bit, you can see that if Wagner's committed to the Bakhmut fight, it's possible that the actual Russian forces are flowing through Luhansk north to Severodonetsk and through Donetsk to areas further south and west. So it's not crazy that a small pocket of Wagner forces are the only ones really holding down this potential little pocket. And the third series of strikes they'll try to do, they'll go in several directions simultaneously. From the bottom, they'll go to Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, trying to cut the LPR, DPR into two parts. This is the direction of the first strike. This is the direction of the second strike. This is the direction of the group for the third strike. Next, they'll certainly try concentrating in Dnipro. Reach Zaporozhye direction and deal several strikes near Zaporozhye in order to reach Berdansk, Melitopol, and Mariupol, thus blocking Crimea. This is an old map with the border along Crimea. They'll block Crimea, and then most likely they'll try to deal with the Crimea Bridge, and thus push the situation to the borders of 1991. All right, we started to bounce around a little bit here. So to rehash, we have a Ukrainian attack on Belgorod. Then here he lays out an attack through the Savato-Kremina line, followed by a multi-phase attack through Bakhmut with a goal of splitting the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic in two. So it's not perfectly clear to me, at least, if Prigozhin thinks these attacks will happen simultaneously, if one happens after the other, or if each is dependent upon the success of the previous operation. I mean, he labels them as 1, 2, 3, 4, but I sort of read that as him just listing them out. But either way, the last portion of his assessment here is that Ukrainian forces will push south from Zaporozhye. His prediction here isn't really anything out of the norm. Lots of folks have been eyeing this area as a potential location for a counteroffensive for some time, so much so that Russia appears to be focusing some of their defensive build-out in that area. This map shows Russian defensive positions that have been identified with satellite imagery. You can see the concentration south of Zaporozhye to where there appear to be multiple lines constructed. A link to this map is in the description if you want to explore it further. Now, an attack in this direction reminds me of the Kherson offensive last fall. Technically, it was a secret, but man, so many people were talking about that as the site of the operation that Russia had time to reinforce with some of their more well-equipped and trained units before it even kicked off. Losses are still unknown, but Ukrainian progress there was slow and eventually stopped. Now, big picture, Ukraine did retake the city of Kherson after Russian forces withdrew across the river, so it's not as though that offensive failed, but it was expected. And when casualty figures are eventually released, I imagine the lack of surprise will be reflected in those. So assuming an offensive south from Zaporozhye can be successful at an acceptable level of loss, that's huge for Ukraine. The threat of splitting Russian forces between the Donbass and Crimea changes the nature of this fight in a way we really haven't seen since the early days of the war. An action like that forces Russia to counterattack to maintain ground lines of communication right in the middle of their force. And it's for that reason that any attack there could be potentially very risky. Prigozhin wraps up by saying that this southern push would attempt to block Crimea, at which point Ukraine would begin targeting the Crimean bridge. Of the pieces laid out by Prigozhin so far, this fourth point to me is likely the most enticing to Ukrainian leadership. There's a reason that a common refrain is that Crimea is Ukraine. It's an emotionally charged subject and sort of a rallying cry for a lot of folks involved in the war. Regaining control of Crimea would be a substantial blow to Russia, so much so that some have speculated that risk may precipitate the use of Russian nuclear weapons. You just don't hear the same emotion when Ukrainians are talking about pushing into Russian territory or retaking areas of the Donbass. I have to think something similar to this final point of Prigozhin's is on a Ukrainian military planning table somewhere. Cut off Russian forces through Melitopol, start using drones and missiles to attack the bridge, forcing Russia to use sea and air transport to reinforce the peninsula. That sets the stage for what could be a long-term siege, or perhaps a follow-on offensive to retake Crimea with military force. Now, the big unknown around all of this is the status and disposition of the two opposing forces. We can speculate all we want, but the reality is that it's just not public information for either side. That means that predicting outcomes is prone to reflect what someone wants to see happen more than what is likely to play out. Recognizing that, I tend to believe that what we're most likely to see in the coming months, if we're looking, only at Prigozhin's prediction here, is a counterattack around Bakhmut, followed by an attempt to push south towards the Sea of Azov. My thought process there is that Bakhmut has become an opportunity. Forces there are likely exhausted, and it represents a seam in the Russian lines, an area where two or more commands come together. Any attack on a seam between units creates an added layer of complexity for the defenders, and the battlefield around Bakhmut looks to be a pretty clear separation of forces between Wagner and the Russian military. The push south towards the Sea of Azov is a big gamble, but if we're talking about strategic aims of Ukraine in the war, it's hard to look past the retaking of Crimea. Continued Western aid is no guarantee, and Ukraine needs that to stay in the fight. So I'm guessing that Ukraine will attempt a large-scale offensive that could turn the tide of the war rather than multiple small pushes aimed at retaking a few kilometers of land somewhere across the Donbass. That's the idea that taking or pressuring Russia and Crimea could open the door for negotiations in the east, but it's hard to see a scenario where progress in the east favors a Ukrainian solution in Crimea. I think that's what Ukraine will attempt, but I'm not going to pretend to have enough information to predict any sort of success or failure even before it kicks off. But what do you think? Is Prigozhin on the right track about what Ukraine is up to? Is he pushing a narrative to suit his own needs, or maybe some weird combination of the two? That's all I got for now. We'll see y'all next time.